Few figures in literary history command the kind of enduring fascination that Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde does. Born in Dublin in 1854, Wilde became one of the most celebrated, witty and scandalous personalities of the Victorian era. His works, ranging from poetry and essays to plays and his sole novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, remain fixtures in the canon of English literature, studied as much for their artistic merit as for their subversive social commentary. His sharp wit, flamboyant style and provocative challenges to Victorian morality made him a darling of high society for a time, but these very qualities also set the stage for his spectacular downfall. Arrested and imprisoned for gross indecency due to his homosexual relationships, Wilde's life became a cautionary tale as much as an inspiration, ending in poverty and exile in Paris in 1900. The story of Oscar Wilde is not simply one of art, scandal and decline. It is also the story of an era, the rigid moral codes, the glittering hypocrisies of Victorian England, and the dangerous intersections of art and identity. Wilde was a man who dared to embody the ideals of the aesthetic movement, declaring that beauty and pleasure were ends in themselves. His quips, aphorisms, and paradoxes became part of the cultural fabric, often masking deeper critiques of the society he both charmed and provoked. To his admirers, Wilde was a modern Socrates, using wit and paradox to unsettle the assumptions of the day. To his detractors, he was the embodiment of decadence and moral corruption, a threat to the carefully constructed order of respectable Victorian life. In examining Wilde's life and works, one encounters a figure of extraordinary contradictions. He was both a serious thinker and a consummate entertainer, a husband and father who also engaged in passionate same-sex relationships, a man who enjoyed the luxuries of high society yet was exiled to poverty, a writer whose works brimmed with irony and satire, yet who wrote some of the most poignant lines about human suffering. His life illustrates not only the precariousness of fame, but also the costs of living authentically in a world determined to punish difference. Oscar Wilde's legacy extends far beyond his literary output. He has become an icon of wit, style, and resistance. His persona, long hair, velvet jackets, lilies in hand, was itself a kind of performance art. Wilde cultivated the role of the aesthete, one who elevated beauty above all else, at a time when Britain was caught between industrial progress and moral restraint. His public image was as carefully crafted as any of his plays, and it is this image that endures as much as his words. Even today, Wilde's aphorisms appear on posters, mugs, and social media feeds. Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken. I can resist everything except temptation, and the only way to get rid of a temptation is to yield to it. Yet it is important to remember that Wilde's persona came at a cost. By making himself a living symbol of decadence and contradiction, he exposed himself to ridicule, envy, and ultimately persecution. His trials in 1895 were not only about his private life, they were about his audacity to live openly in defiance of a society obsessed with appearances. His downfall reveals as much about the repressive nature of Victorian England as it does about Wilde himself. While Wilde is often remembered for the scandal of his later years, his literary works remain enduring testaments to his genius. The Picture of Dorian Gray shocked Victorian readers with its frank treatment of hedonism and moral corruption, while his plays, The Importance of Being Earnest, An Ideal Husband, Lady Windermere's Fan, redefined the comic stage with their blend of social satire and verbal brilliance. His essays, such as The Soul of Man Under Socialism, reveal a serious philosophical side, advocating for individualism, art, and freedom. Even his prison writings, especially De Profundis and the Ballad of Reading Gaol, stand as some of the most moving reflections on suffering, forgiveness, and human dignity in English letters. Wilde was not simply a writer of clever lines and sparkling comedies. He was a thinker who questioned the values of his society, who asked what it meant to live truthfully, and who embodied, often at great personal cost, the tension between individual desire and collective morality. His works remind us that literature is never divorced from life, and that art can be both a refuge and a battleground. Why does Wilde still matter more than a century after his death? Part of the answer lies in the timelessness of his wit and the universality of his struggles. His plays continue to delight audiences with their humor and elegance, while his critiques of hypocrisy and superficiality resonate as much today as they did in Victorian drawing rooms. His life story has become a symbol for LGBTQ+ rights and for the dangers of societal intolerance. Wilde's imprisonment and exile highlight the costs of criminalizing love, a lesson still relevant in many parts of the world. Furthermore, Wilde's belief in the transformative power of art feels particularly urgent in an age of utilitarianism and materialism. He insisted that beauty and imagination were not luxuries but necessities, that art was a way of shaping life itself. His aphorisms, though playful, often carried deep truths about the human condition. Wilde's legacy, then, is not merely literary but existential. He challenges us to ask who we are, what we value, and how much we are willing to risk in order to live authentically. This essay will trace the arc of Wilde's life in detail, from his privileged Dublin upbringing in a household steeped in intellectual pursuits to his education at Trinity College and Oxford, where he embraced aestheticism, to his meteoric rise as one of London's most celebrated writers. It will examine the context of the aesthetic movement, Wilde's role as its most famous representative, and the ways in which his persona and works reflected and subverted Victorian culture. The essay will then turn to Wilde's personal life, his marriage to Constance Lloyd, his fatherhood and his relationships with men, especially Lord Alfred Douglas. It will analyze the trials of 1895, in which Wilde's wit and defiance were not enough to shield him from a society determined to make an example of him. The final sections will explore Wilde's prison writings, his impoverished final years in Paris, and the remarkable afterlife of his reputation from disgrace to cultural sainthood. By examining Wilde's life in this way, the essay seeks to show not only the brilliance of his art, but also the human costs of his defiance. Wilde was both a man of his time and ahead of it, both deeply flawed and profoundly inspiring. His story is a reminder that genius and tragedy often walk hand in hand, and that the true measure of a life is not in its conformity, but in its courage to break the mold. Oscar Fingal O'Flaherty Wills Wilde was born on October 16, 1854 in Dublin, Ireland, into a household that was as unusual as it was intellectually stimulating. His father, Sir William Wilde, was a prominent surgeon specializing in diseases of the ear and eye, and a man of wide-ranging curiosity. Beyond medicine, he was a writer of folklore and antiquarian studies, collecting stories and traditions of Ireland that reflected both scholarly rigor and romantic nationalism. His reputation was somewhat ambivalent, professionally admired but socially controversial, particularly after scandals surrounding his extramarital affairs. Oscar's mother, Jane Francesca L.J. Wilde, known by her pen name Speranza, was a poet, translator, and fiery nationalist. She became a central figure in Dublin's intellectual circles, hosting salons where writers, artists, and revolutionaries gathered to debate politics, literature, and Ireland's cultural future. Her poetry, often infused with passionate support for Irish independence, made her something of a heroine in nationalist circles. Jane Wilde instilled in her children, Oscar, his older brother William, and younger sister Isola, a love of language, art, and political engagement. Growing up in such a household, Wilde was surrounded by books, conversation, and controversy. From his mother, he inherited not only a gift for language, but also a sense of performance and defiance against convention. From his father, he absorbed both intellectual curiosity and the dangers of scandal, lessons that would echo throughout his life. Oscar Wilde's early schooling reflected both privilege and discipline. He first attended Portora Royal School in Enniskillen, a prestigious boarding school known for its emphasis on classical studies. Here Wilde began to excel in Latin and Greek, developing a foundation in classical literature that would inform much of his later writing. Portora was also the birthplace of Wilde's growing appreciation for wit and intellectual showmanship. He was not simply a diligent student, but also a boy who entertained peers with sharp observations and a natural flair for dramatic storytelling. Tragedy touched Wilde's youth with the death of his beloved younger sister Isola in 1867, when she was just 9 years old. Oscar, then 12, was deeply affected. He carried a lock of her hair in a locket for the rest of his life, and her death introduced him to grief, an experience that would later inform some of the tenderest passages in his writings. Though remembered as a flamboyant wit, Wilde's early confrontation with loss gave him a profound emotional depth that complicated his later public persona. At 17, Wilde entered Trinity College, Dublin, one of Ireland's premier institutions. He quickly distinguished himself as a brilliant classicist, winning prizes and impressing professors with his command of Greek and Latin texts. Under the mentorship of John Pentland Mahaffy, a renowned classicist and wit himself, Wilde deepened his love for antiquity and began developing the aphoristic style that would become his hallmark. Mahaffy once remarked that Wilde was the only student he had ever had who was brilliant enough to think for himself. Trinity was also a place where Wilde learned to navigate intellectual and social circles. He began to cultivate the persona of the aesthete, dressing with care and speaking in polished epigrams. He became a familiar figure in debates and literary societies, where he displayed both his intellectual range and his flair for showmanship. Wilde's time at Trinity confirmed his identity, not just as a scholar but as a performer, someone for whom words were both weapons and art. His achievements at Trinity culminated in winning a prestigious scholarship to Magdalen College, Oxford, in 1874. This was a crucial turning point, for Oxford would provide Wilde not only with academic opportunities, but also with the cultural milieu in which his distinctive philosophy of art and life would flourish. When Wilde arrived at Oxford, he entered an environment that was simultaneously rigorous and indulgent, steeped in tradition, yet open to new movements. He threw himself into the study of classical literature, philosophy, and art, excelling academically while also immersing himself in the cultural debates of the day. Wilde's years at Oxford coincided with the rise of the aesthetic movement, a cultural trend that emphasized art for art's sake, l'art pour l'art. Led by figures like Walter Pater and influenced by John Ruskin's ideas, the movement rejected utilitarian views of art as moral instruction or social utility. Instead, it celebrated beauty, form, and artistic experience as ends in themselves. Wilde eagerly embraced these ideas, especially after reading Pater's The Renaissance, 1873, with its famous call to burn always with this hard, gem-like flame. For Wilde, Oxford was not merely a place of study but a stage. He began to cultivate his trademark flamboyant style, long hair, colorful clothes, and a deliberate air of eccentricity. His rooms at Magdalen were decorated with peacock feathers, lilies, and blue china, embodying the aesthetic ideals he championed. Wilde became a figure of fascination and ridicule on campus, admired by some for his brilliance and mocked by others for his theatricality. Yet even the mockery fed Wilde's growing reputation as someone who lived artfully, who turned even daily life into a performance. Despite his flamboyant persona, Wilde's academic record was impressive. He won the Newdigate Prize for Poetry in 1878 for his poem Ravenna, an achievement that brought him national recognition. His studies in classics were rigorous, and he graduated with a double first in Literae Humaniores, marking him as one of the brightest scholars of his generation. But Wilde was never content to be merely a scholar. His ambitions extended beyond academia into the broader cultural world. He began publishing poetry and essays, testing his voice as a writer and critic. More importantly, he began to see himself as a cultural figure, someone who could shape not only literature but also taste itself. By the time Wilde left Oxford in 1878, he had already constructed much of the persona that would make him famous. He was the aesthete, the apostle of beauty, the wit whose remarks could both dazzle and sting. Yet beneath the surface, performance laid genuine convictions about the role of art in life. Wilde truly believed that beauty was not frivolous, but essential, that art could elevate existence and challenge convention. Oxford had given him the intellectual foundation, the social stage, and the philosophical convictions that would define his career. It had also taught him the risks of standing apart. His flamboyance earned him notoriety, but it also invited mockery and suspicion. These tensions between brilliance and scandal, authenticity and performance, admiration and ridicule, would follow him throughout his life. After Oxford, Wilde moved to London, where he began his career in earnest. He published his first volume of poetry in 1881 and embarked on a lecture tour in the United States in 1882, spreading the gospel of aestheticism. By this point, Wilde had become as famous for his appearance and quips as for his writings. His reputation as a cultural personality was firmly established, paving the way for his literary triumphs in the following decades. But all of this, the fame, the works, the scandals, was rooted in those early years in Dublin and Oxford. Wilde's upbringing in a household of intellectual passion, his classical education, his early tragedies, and his Oxford embrace of aestheticism all combined to form the man who would become both one of the greatest writers of his age and one of its most tragic figures. By the time Oscar Wilde settled in London in the late 1870s, he was already more than a promising young scholar. He was a personality. His eccentric Oxford persona had preceded him, and the capital's literary and social circles were curious to see what he would make of himself. In London, he faced the dual challenge of establishing himself as a writer, while also sustaining the flamboyant identity he had so carefully crafted. London in the 1880s was a city of contradictions, the heart of an empire at its zenith, bursting with wealth and innovation, yet still shackled by rigid social codes and moral pretenses. It was a place where artists, intellectuals, and reformers rubbed shoulders with aristocrats and industrialists. Wilde, with his blend of intellect, wit, and theatrical self-presentation, was well suited to thrive in this environment. The aesthetic movement, which had begun to take shape during Wilde's Oxford years, was reaching its height. Often caricatured as a cult of beauty and frivolity, aestheticism challenged Victorian utilitarianism by asserting that art should not be judged by moral or practical concerns, but only by its beauty and emotional effect. The movement attracted artists, writers, and designers who sought to break free from conventional standards, and it sparked fierce debates about the role of art in society. Wilde quickly became its most famous representative. With his velvet jackets, lilies, and paradoxical quips, he seemed to embody the aesthete caricature that Punch magazine loved to lampoon. But Wilde was not content to be merely a poster child. He was a serious advocate of aesthetic principles. He argued that life itself should be lived artfully, that beauty was not superficial, but essential. In this sense, Wilde used performance to reinforce philosophy. His flamboyance was not mere vanity, but a declaration of aesthetic truth. Wilde's first major foray into print came in 1881 when he published Poems, a collection of verse that drew on classical, romantic, and aesthetic influences. The volume received mixed reviews. Some critics dismissed it as derivative, borrowing too heavily from Keats, Rossetti, and Swinburne. Others, however, recognized flashes of brilliance, particularly in Wilde's ability to craft evocative imagery and poignant emotion. Though the book did not establish Wilde as a major poet, it achieved respectable sales, and more importantly, solidified his image as a man of letters. It also attracted enough attention to earn him an invitation that would dramatically expand his influence: a lecture tour of the United States. In January 1882, Wilde sailed for the United States to begin a lecture tour that would last nearly a year. The tour had been arranged partly to promote Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta Patience, which satirized aestheticism. Wilde was to be the living embodiment of the aesthete, a figure audiences could see for themselves. From the moment he landed in New York and declared to customs officials, "I have nothing to declare but my genius," Wilde captured American imagination. He lectured on topics such as the English Renaissance of art and the decorative arts, bringing aesthetic philosophy to audiences across the country. He visited cities from New York and Boston to San Francisco and Denver, speaking in grand theaters and small halls alike. The American press followed him closely, often mocking his appearance and mannerisms, yet his wit and charisma won many admirers. While some ridiculed him as a poseur, others took his ideas seriously. His lectures on interior design and the importance of beauty resonated in a nation grappling with industrialization and cultural identity. Wilde's influence even extended to fashion and household decoration, as he encouraged audiences to embrace beauty in daily life. The tour was a financial success and a cultural sensation. It introduced Wilde to a wider audience and cemented his reputation as not only a writer, but also a performer and cultural critic. It also gave him a taste of celebrity on a global scale, an experience that would shape his ambitions and vulnerabilities in the years to come. After returning from America in late 1882, Wilde continued to lecture in Britain and Ireland. These tours were less sensational but still significant, as they kept his name in public circulation and established him as a figure of authority on matters of art and taste. His lectures touched on subjects such as dress reform, house decoration, and the relationship between art and society. During these years, Wilde honed his public persona even further. He cultivated the image of a witty provocateur, someone who could disarm audiences with paradox and charm. His lectures were not dry treatises, but theatrical performances, filled with anecdotes, jokes, and sharp insights. Audiences might have come expecting to laugh at him, but many left impressed, even inspired. Alongside lecturing, Wilde began to publish essays and reviews, contributing to periodicals such as the 19th Century and Dublin University magazine. These writings revealed his growing skill as a critic and thinker. His essays often challenged conventional wisdom, championing aesthetic principles, while also exploring the moral dimensions of art. One of Wilde's central arguments was that art should not be judged by moral standards, but by its ability to create beauty and evoke emotion. Yet he was not indifferent to moral questions. Rather, he saw beauty itself as a moral force, capable of elevating the spirit and enriching human experience. This nuanced position often eluded critics who dismissed him as frivolous. In 1884, Wilde married Constance Lloyd, the daughter of a prominent Irish barrister. The marriage provided him with social stability and respectability, counterbalancing his flamboyant public persona. Constance was intelligent, well-read, and sympathetic to Wilde's ideas, though their marriage would later be strained by Wilde's relationships with men. The couple had two sons, Cyril, born 1885, and Vivian, born 1886, whom Wilde adored. Fatherhood added a new dimension to Wilde's writing. He began to craft children's stories, many of which were published in The Happy Prince and Other Tales, 1888. These stories, though whimsical, often carried poignant moral lessons and revealed a tender side to Wilde's imagination. They remain some of his most beloved works, cherished for their blend of fantasy and pathos. In 1887, Wilde was appointed editor of The Ladies' World, a women's magazine that he rebranded as The Woman's World. Under his editorship, the magazine expanded beyond fashion and society gossip to include serious articles on literature, politics, and women's issues. Wilde sought to elevate the publication, reflecting his belief that women should be intellectually engaged in cultural debates. Though Wilde's tenure as editor lasted only 2 years, it showcased his versatility and his commitment to cultural criticism. It also gave him a platform from which to shape public discourse, particularly around the role of women in Victorian society. By the late 1880s, Wilde had established himself as a man of culture, a poet, lecturer, essayist, and editor. Yet he still had not achieved the literary triumph that would secure his place in history. That moment would come in the 1890s, when he turned his attention to drama and fiction. His novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, 1890, would scandalize Victorian readers with its frank exploration of beauty, corruption, and desire. His plays, beginning with Lady Windermere's Fan, 1892, would transform the London stage with their dazzling wit and social satire. But all of this, the novels, the plays, the controversies, was built upon the foundation of the 1880s, when Wilde rose to prominence as the quintessential aesthete, the prophet of beauty, and the wit who made even his life a work of art. By the early 1890s, Oscar Wilde had transformed himself from a flamboyant lecturer and cultural personality into a serious literary figure. He had experimented in poetry, journalism, and children's stories, but it was in fiction and drama that his genius found its fullest expression. Wilde's writing in this period not only established his reputation, but also defined the themes and style that continue to make his work relevant today: wit, satire, moral paradox, and a relentless interrogation of the hypocrisy of Victorian society. Wilde's most famous prose work, The Picture of Dorian Gray, was first published in Lippincott's Monthly magazine in 1890 and later revised for book publication in 1891. The novel tells the story of a young man, Dorian Gray, who remains physically youthful, while his portrait ages and bears the marks of his moral corruption. Influenced by Lord Henry Wotton, a figure of dazzling cynicism and aesthetic hedonism, Dorian plunges into a life of indulgence and vice, all the while maintaining an outward mask of innocence. The novel provoked an immediate scandal. Critics denounced it as immoral, decadent, even poisonous. The suggestion of homoeroticism in the relationship between Dorian and the artist Basil Hallward further fueled outrage. Wilde defended his work with characteristic wit, arguing that there is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all. In truth, Dorian Gray was neither a simple celebration of hedonism nor a conventional moral tale. It was a complex meditation on the relationship between art, life, and morality. The portrait symbolized the hidden consequences of a life devoted to selfish pleasure, while Dorian himself embodied the dangers of separating external appearances from internal reality. The book established Wilde as a novelist of rare daring, one willing to confront the anxieties of his age about beauty, corruption, and authenticity. Parallel to his fiction, Wilde developed a reputation as a formidable essayist and critic. His essays, collected in works like Intentions, 1891, reveal his sharp intellect and his belief in the autonomy of art. In essays such as The Critic as Artist, The Decay of Lying, and Pen, Pencil and Poison, Wilde articulated a vision of criticism and art that was both provocative and liberating. He argued that art was not meant to reflect life but to shape it. Life imitates art far more than art imitates life, he declared in The Decay of Lying, turning conventional wisdom on its head. For Wilde, criticism itself was a creative act, not merely a response to art, but a form of art in its own right. These essays elevated aesthetics into philosophy, blending paradox, wit, and argument into dazzling displays of intellectual gymnastics. While critics sometimes dismissed these works as playful sophistry, Wilde's essays contributed significantly to debates about art and culture. They anticipated modernist and postmodernist views of representation, artifice, and interpretation, revealing Wilde as not just a wit, but a serious thinker who questioned the very foundations of how we understand art and life. In the midst of his essays and fiction, Wilde also produced works for children, most notably The Happy Prince and Other Tales, 1888, and A House of Pomegranates, 1891. These stories, though written for young readers, carry a haunting poignancy and moral depth. Tales such as The Happy Prince, The Nightingale and the Rose, and The Selfish Giant reveal Wilde's capacity for tenderness and spiritual reflection. In these works, themes of sacrifice, love, and redemption dominate, often contrasted with human selfishness and indifference. The Happy Prince, for instance, tells of a statue that gives away all its riches to help the poor, ultimately crumbling but achieving spiritual transcendence. These stories demonstrated that Wilde's imagination was not limited to satire and paradox, but extended to the realm of the deeply humane. It was, however, on the stage that Wilde achieved his greatest triumphs. The early 1890s marked his ascent as one of the leading dramatists of his era. His plays combined sparkling dialogue, biting satire, and a sharp critique of social conventions, particularly around class, gender, and morality. Lady Windermere's Fan, 1892. Wilde's first major theatrical success, this play explores themes of marriage, morality, and social reputation. Its mix of melodrama and comedy delighted audiences and critics alike, showcasing Wilde's ability to entertain while subtly undermining conventional morality. A Woman of No Importance, 1893. This play deepened Wilde's critique of Victorian gender roles, highlighting the double standards applied to men and women in matters of reputation and sexuality. Though not as tightly constructed as his later works, it demonstrated his growing command of the stage. An Ideal Husband, 1895. One of Wilde's most accomplished plays, it revolves around political corruption, blackmail, and questions of integrity. It combines serious themes with comic brilliance, revealing Wilde's capacity to balance entertainment with moral inquiry. The Importance of Being Earnest, 1895. Wilde's masterpiece and perhaps the greatest English comedy of manners, this play satirizes Victorian seriousness through a dazzling web of mistaken identities, absurdities, and epigrams. Lines such as "the truth is rarely pure and never simple" encapsulate Wilde's gift for paradox. The play was a triumph, cementing Wilde's reputation as the preeminent playwright of his day. What made Wilde's plays so powerful was not merely their humor, but their capacity to expose the hypocrisies of society. Through clever dialogue and farcical situations, Wilde revealed the absurdity of rigid social codes and the fragility of respectability. His plays entertained Victorian audiences even as they unsettled them, holding up a mirror to a society obsessed with appearances and moral posturing. In The Importance of Being Earnest, for example, Wilde eschewed the triviality of upper-class concerns, exposing how matters of profound identity, such as one's name or lineage, were treated with absurd seriousness, while genuine moral questions were brushed aside. Wilde's genius lay in making audiences laugh at themselves, even as they resisted the implications of his satire. By 1895, Oscar Wilde was at the pinnacle of his career. His plays were critical and commercial successes, his essays widely read, his wit celebrated in salons and newspapers. He was one of the most famous men in England, admired for his brilliance and style. Society clamored for his presence, and his aphorisms were quoted endlessly. Yet even at the height of his fame, cracks were beginning to appear. His private life, especially his increasingly open relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, was drawing scrutiny. His enemies in the press, long irritated by his flamboyance, sharpened their knives. The very visibility that had made Wilde a celebrity also made him vulnerable. His plays, while triumphs, could not shield him from the gathering storm. What is striking about Wilde's literary career is how inseparable it was from his persona. He did not simply write plays and essays, he performed them through his life. The paradoxes of his work echoed the paradoxes of his identity. Moralist and hedonist, critic and entertainer, husband and lover of men, celebrated genius and scandalized exile. Wilde's art was, in a sense, his life, and his life, his art. This fusion of art and identity would ultimately contribute to his downfall. The society that laughed at his plays and applauded his wit would soon turn on him, using the very persona he had crafted as evidence against him. The next stage of Wilde's story would no longer be about art's triumphs, but about society's vengeance, as the trials of 1895 exposed both Wilde's private life and Victorian England's cruelty. By 1895, Oscar Wilde stood at the zenith of his career. The London stage had embraced his plays, critics hailed him as a master of wit, and audiences flocked to theatres to hear his dazzling dialogue. An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest, staged within weeks of each other in early 1895, marked the culmination of his theatrical success. Wilde was no longer just a writer, he was a celebrity, a man whose very presence in a drawing room or at a dinner party guaranteed entertainment. Theatrical success brought Wilde financial rewards, though he was never prudent with money. He lived extravagantly, staying in luxurious hotels, dining lavishly, and dressing with characteristic flamboyance. His home life with Constance Lloyd and their two sons provided a veneer of respectability. Yet Wilde increasingly spent his time in the company of young men, particularly Lord Alfred Douglas. Wilde's relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas, nicknamed Bosie, became both the greatest passion of his life and the cause of his destruction. Douglas, the son of the Marquis of Queensberry, was a handsome, volatile, and self-indulgent young poet. Wilde was captivated by Bosie's beauty, charm, and reckless energy, while Douglas admired Wilde's genius and relished the privileges of his fame. Their relationship was stormy, marked by intense affection and frequent quarrels. Wilde showered Douglas with gifts, often to the detriment of his finances. Together, they frequented restaurants, hotels, and private clubs, enjoying a lifestyle that blended indulgence with danger. For while homosexuality was criminalized under British law, Wilde seemed increasingly careless, leaving himself vulnerable to scandal. Douglas introduced Wilde to a circle of young working-class men, some of whom later testified against him in court. These encounters, often transactional in nature, exposed Wilde to blackmail and gossip. Yet Wilde seemed intoxicated by the thrill of living dangerously, as though his life were itself another play in which he starred. If Wilde's relationship with Douglas was tempestuous, his dealings with Douglas's father, John Sholto Douglas, the 9th Marquess of Queensberry, were explosive. The Marquess was a notorious figure, violent, erratic, and prone to public outbursts. Outraged by Wilde's relationship with his son, Queensberry embarked on a campaign to discredit and humiliate him. Queensberry left insulting calling cards at Wilde's club, attempted to disrupt performances of his plays, and spread accusations of Wilde's immorality. In February 1895, he left a particularly infamous card at the Albemarle Club, addressed to Oscar Wilde posing sodomite sick. This misspelled insult would trigger the disastrous chain of events that led to Wilde's trials. Ironically, at the very moment Queensberry was sharpening his attacks, Wilde was enjoying his greatest triumph. The Importance of Being Earnest, which opened in February 1895, was an immediate success. Audiences adored its sparkling dialogue, absurd scenarios, and satirical treatment of Victorian respectability. Critics praised its brilliance, though some hinted uneasily at the subversive undertones of Wilde's humour. Wilde basked in the acclaim, attending performances and reveling in his status as London's most celebrated playwright. He was the darling of society, quoted in newspapers, invited to the grandest gatherings, and admired for his wit. Yet beneath the glamour the storm was gathering. Wilde's very visibility made him an irresistible target for scandal, and his enemies sensed weakness. When Queensberry left the libelous card at Wilde's club, Wilde had a choice: ignore it and continue his glittering career, or confront Queensberry in court. Against the advice of friends, Wilde chose to sue Queensberry for criminal libel. It was a fateful decision. Wilde's motives were complex. Pride undoubtedly played a role. He could not bear to let the insult go unanswered. His relationship with Douglas also influenced him. Bosie was determined to fight his father and pressed Wilde to take action. Wilde may also have believed that his charm and wit could carry him through, as they so often had in society. Whatever his reasons, the lawsuit was a catastrophic miscalculation. Queensberry and his lawyers prepared a devastating defense, gathering evidence of Wilde's relationships with young men. What began as Wilde's attempt to defend his reputation would soon turn into a public exposure of his private life. Wilde's decision to sue revealed how fragile his position truly was. For all his fame, he lived in a society where homosexuality was criminalized and vilified. The very qualities that made him admired, his flamboyance, his epigrams, his defiance of convention, could easily be turned against him. His plays, filled with paradoxes and double meanings, were mined by critics for evidence of immorality. His aesthetic persona, once a source of fascination, became a liability. The irony of Wilde's fame was cruel. He had spent years crafting a public identity, turning himself into a work of art. But in doing so, he had made himself inseparable from his art, a living symbol of aestheticism and decadence. When society turned against him, it was not just his private life that was judged, but his entire philosophy. Wilde had made himself the stage. Now he would be the spectacle of his own undoing. It is tempting to see Wilde's height of fame as a time of pure triumph, but in truth it was already shadowed by tension. He lived a double life: the public man of letters, husband and father, and the private man who sought companionship with men in defiance of the law. This double life mirrored the themes of his works. In The Picture of Dorian Gray, outward appearances conceal hidden corruption. In The Importance of Being Earnest, characters invent alter egos to escape social constraints. Wilde himself was living these dramas, and perhaps that is why he seemed to inhabit them so fully. His art and life were intertwined in ways that made separation impossible. As Wilde enjoyed his last season of triumph in 1895, he could not have known how swiftly everything would collapse. Within months, he would be standing trial, his plays closed, his reputation shattered, and his freedom at risk. The height of his fame was inseparable from the brink of his ruin. In retrospect, Wilde's celebrity was both dazzling and precarious. He had achieved what few writers manage, to become not only a literary figure, but a cultural phenomenon. His wit shaped the language of his time, his plays defined the comedy of manners, and his persona fascinated audiences on both sides of the Atlantic. Yet this very success magnified the stakes of his downfall. When Wilde fell, he fell from the highest of heights, making his tragedy all the more dramatic. In March 1895, Oscar Wilde entered the courts not as a defendant but as a plaintiff. Outraged by the Marquis of Queensberry's insulting calling card, for Oscar Wilde, posing sodomite, sick, he had brought a charge of criminal libel. Wilde believed, perhaps naively, that his charm, reputation and wit would carry the day. He was encouraged, even pressured, by Lord Alfred Douglas, who longed to humiliate his father. The case was fraught from the start. Queensberry's defence was straightforward, to prove the truth of his allegation. Under British law, if Queensberry could demonstrate that Wilde had indeed engaged in homosexual acts, then his libelous statement would be justified. Thus Wilde's private life, already the subject of gossip, was about to be dissected before the public. Wilde's testimony in the libel trial revealed both the brilliance of his wit and the peril of his arrogance. When cross-examined by Edward Carson, Queensberry's barrister and a fellow Dubliner who had once known Wilde at Trinity College, Wilde delivered some of the most famous lines of his life. When asked about the morality of the picture of Dorian Gray, Wilde retorted that art could not be judged by ethical standards. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written, that is all. Such epigrams, though dazzling, did little to help his legal case. Carson pressed further, asking about Wilde's friendships with young men of lower social classes, valets, grooms and clerks. Wilde attempted to laugh off the insinuations, claiming these relationships were purely platonic. When asked whether he had ever kissed a young man, Wilde replied, "Oh dear no, he was far too ugly." The court erupted in laughter, but the remark was damning, for it suggested that Wilde judged the question not by principle, but by attraction. Wilde's wit, which had made him a darling of society, now made him seem flippant in the face of grave accusations. What played well in a drawing room looked reckless in a courtroom. Queensberry's defence assembled a damning case. Letters from Wilde to Douglas, filled with extravagant language and affection, were produced as evidence of inappropriate relationships. Though Wilde insisted they were merely artistic expressions of friendship, the language was difficult to dismiss. One letter called Douglas "my darling boy" and spoke of red rose-leaf lips. More damaging still were the witnesses. Several young men testified to having had sexual encounters with Wilde, often in exchange for gifts or money. Some accounts were embellished or unreliable, but they painted a portrait of Wilde as a man who pursued relationships that Victorian society considered criminal. Faced with mounting evidence, Wilde's lawyers realized the libel case was doomed. They withdrew the prosecution, leaving Wilde responsible for the costs. But worse was to come. The collapse of the libel suit opened the door for Wilde's own prosecution. On April 26, 1895, Wilde was arrested and charged with gross indecency, a broad legal category under the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 that criminalized homosexual acts between men. The man who had been the toast of London theatres just weeks before was now a prisoner, awaiting trial. Public reaction was swift and brutal. Wilde's plays were forced to close despite their success. Newspapers that had once quoted his wit with delight now vilified him as a corrupter of youth. Friends and acquaintances deserted him. Society that had laughed at his epigrams now turned its back in self-righteous scorn. The first criminal trial of Wilde began in late April 1895. The prosecution presented testimony from several young men who described encounters with Wilde in hotels and private rooms. Many of the witnesses were of working-class backgrounds, male prostitutes or youths on the margins of society, whose testimony was easily sensationalized. Wilde's defense strategy was to undermine their credibility and to argue that his relationships were innocent. Once again, he delivered eloquent speeches about the purity of friendship and the nature of art. He insisted that the love of an older man for a younger one could be noble, citing examples from Greek history. These arguments, however, struck Victorian jurors as scandalous rather than persuasive. The trial ended with the jury unable to reach a verdict, resulting in a mistrial. Wilde might have fled the country at this point. Many of his friends urged him to do so. France beckoned, offering a refuge beyond the reach of British law. But Wilde, exhausted, indecisive, and perhaps unwilling to admit defeat, remained in England. A second trial began in May 1895, and this time the outcome was decisive. The prosecution intensified its case, presenting witnesses who described Wilde's behavior in more detail. The tone of the trial was merciless. The press vilified Wilde as a monster of decadence. His writings, once celebrated, were now interpreted as confessions of corruption. Wilde's defense faltered. The jury was unconvinced by his eloquence, and the evidence, though circumstantial, was damning in the eyes of a society eager to punish. On May 25, 1895, Wilde was convicted of gross indecency and sentenced to 2 years hard labor. The sentence was the maximum allowed under the law, a reflection of both the gravity of the charges and the desire to make an example of him. The conviction of Oscar Wilde sent shockwaves through England and beyond. To many Victorians, it confirmed their fears about aestheticism and decadence. Wilde, who had once seemed merely a charming eccentric, was now cast as a symbol of moral corruption. Yet others saw the conviction as a travesty of justice. Some artists and intellectuals recognized the cruelty of punishing a man for his private life. George Bernard Shaw, though critical of Wilde's flamboyance, acknowledged the injustice. Over time, Wilde's trial would come to symbolize the repression and hypocrisy of Victorian society. But in 1895, few dared to defend him publicly. The speed of Wilde's fall was breathtaking. In February 1895, he had been the toast of London, his plays triumphant on the West End stage. By May, he was a convict, stripped of reputation, wealth, and freedom. His wife Constance fled abroad with their children, changing their surname to Holland to escape the scandal. Wilde's possessions were auctioned to pay legal costs, and his literary career was shattered. The trials revealed not only the fragility of Wilde's fame, but also the mercilessness of a society that punished difference. Wilde had lived by paradox, but there was no irony in his downfall. The man who had entertained the world with laughter was now condemned to silence and suffering. The Wilde trials were more than legal proceedings, they were cultural spectacles. Newspapers covered them obsessively, turning Wilde's private life into public theatre. Every quip, every letter, every accusation was scrutinized. The same society that had revelled in Wilde's plays now watched his humiliation with voyeuristic fascination. In many ways, the trials reflected the anxieties of Victorian England. The figure of Wilde became a vessel for fears about sexuality, art, class, and morality. To condemn him was to reaffirm social norms, to draw a line between respectability and deviance. Wilde himself seemed to understand this, remarking, "I am the scapegoat." When Wilde was led away from the courtroom to begin his sentence, he was jeered by crowds that had once applauded him. The irony was cruel. The master of wit and spectacle was now reduced to silence, the entertainer transformed into a pariah. His imprisonment would mark not just the end of his career, but the beginning of a new painful chapter, one that would nevertheless produce some of his most profound writing. Oscar Wilde entered Reading Gaol in May 1895, sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. The transition from celebrated playwright to prisoner was brutal. Stripped of his elegant clothes, denied his social circle, and subjected to the harsh routines of prison life, Wilde was reduced to anonymity. His health, already fragile, deteriorated rapidly. He suffered from hunger, illness, and the grinding monotony of penal labor, which included tasks such as picking oakum, teasing apart tarred rope fibers, and walking the treadmill. Prison in the Victorian era was designed not merely to punish but to break the spirit. Inmates were kept in solitary confinement, forbidden to speak to one another, and subjected to rigid discipline. For Wilde, whose life had been defined by conversation, wit, and social performance, the silence was agonizing. The contrast between his glittering fame and his present degradation could not have been starker. At first, Wilde struggled simply to survive. Reports from prison officials described him as frail, melancholic, and often weeping. He collapsed during chapel services on more than one occasion, prompting concern for his health. His once robust confidence seemed shattered. The wit who had delighted drawing rooms now endured the humiliation of prison rations and degrading labor. Yet Wilde's resilience slowly emerged. Though devastated, he began to turn inward, reflecting on his life, his choices, and his suffering. This process of reflection culminated in one of his greatest works, the long letter he wrote from prison to Lord Alfred Douglas, known today as De Profundis. Written during the final months of his imprisonment, De Profundis, Latin for out of the depths, is a long and searing letter addressed to Douglas. It is at once an indictment, a confession, a meditation, and a spiritual document. Wilde used the letter to recount the destructive nature of his relationship with Douglas, describing how Bose's vanity, demands, and recklessness had contributed to his ruin. Yet Wilde did not simply blame Douglas. He acknowledged his own complicity, admitting that his indulgence, pride, and weakness had led him astray. "I allowed you to dominate me," he wrote, "and to my own hurt." But De Profundis is not merely a personal lament. It is also a profound meditation on suffering, humility, and redemption. Wilde reflected on how prison had stripped him of everything: fame, fortune, family, freedom, and forced him to confront the reality of pain. In suffering, he discovered a deeper truth about life and art. He wrote movingly of Christ as the ultimate artist, the one who transformed suffering into beauty and love. Wilde's tone oscillates between bitterness and serenity, anger and transcendence. He reproaches Douglas for his selfishness, yet also expresses forgiveness. He laments his lost life, yet embraces suffering as a path to wisdom. In passages of great beauty, Wilde speaks of the necessity of embracing sorrow, of seeing suffering not as a punishment, but as a means of transformation. De Profundis was never sent in full to Douglas during Wilde's lifetime. After his release, Wilde entrusted the manuscript to his literary executor, Robert Ross, who published it in a heavily abridged form in 1905. The complete text was not available until the 20th century, when readers could finally grasp its full depth. Today, De Profundis is recognized as one of Wilde's masterpieces, a work of spiritual autobiography that stands alongside the writings of St. Augustine and John Bunyan in its exploration of human frailty and divine grace. If De Profundis was Wilde's prose testament, the Ballad of Reading Gaol, 1898, was his poetic legacy. Written after his release from prison and published under the anonymous signature C33, his prison identification number, the poem reflects on the brutal realities of incarceration and the execution of a fellow prisoner. The ballad describes the hanging of Charles Thomas Wooldridge, a soldier convicted of murdering his wife. Wilde witnessed the preparations for Wooldridge's execution, and the event left a deep impression on him. The poem universalizes this experience, meditating on guilt, punishment, and the common humanity of all prisoners. Lines such as, "Yet each man kills the thing he loves. By each let this be heard. Some do it with a bitter look, some with a flattering word," speak not only to Wooldridge's fate, but to Wilde's own recognition of how his choices and relationships had led to his downfall. The poem is remarkable for its blend of compassion and critique. Wilde portrays prisoners not as monsters but as men broken by circumstance and suffering. He condemns the cruelty of the prison system with its dehumanizing routines and relentless punishments. Yet he also finds moments of grace, suggesting that suffering can reveal profound truths. The Ballad of Reading Gaol was widely acclaimed. Readers who had scorned Wilde during his trial now recognized the power of his words. Its anonymity did not conceal its authorship for long, and Wilde's reputation began to be reassessed, at least as a poet of suffering. Both De Profundis and the Ballad of Reading Gaol reveal how Wilde transformed his suffering into art. Imprisonment had destroyed his worldly success, but it also deepened his insight into the human condition. He emerged from prison not as the sparkling wit of the London stage, but as a chastened, reflective figure who had confronted the darkest depths of existence. Wilde came to see suffering as essential to authenticity. In De Profundis he declared, "Where there is suffering, there is holy ground." For a man who had once lived by paradox and performance, this was a profound shift. Wilde had discovered that beneath artifice lay a raw truth, accessible only through pain. Yet prison's toll on Wilde was immense. His health was permanently damaged. He suffered from ear infections, dysentery, and exhaustion, ailments that would eventually contribute to his early death. Emotionally, he was scarred, carrying a deep sense of loss and isolation. His relationship with his family was shattered. Constance Wilde moved abroad with their children, who were renamed and shielded from their father's disgrace. Financially, Wilde was ruined. His possessions had been sold, his royalties diminished, and his reputation destroyed. Though the Ballad of Reading Gaol provided some income, he was never again financially secure. The writings of Wilde's prison years mark a sharp contrast with his earlier works. Gone is the carefree wit of the Importance of Being Earnest, or the playful paradoxes of his essays. In their place is a voice of gravity, compassion, and humility. Yet even in suffering, Wilde remained an artist. He crafted beauty from despair, turning his anguish into works that continue to resonate with readers across the world. De Profundis and the Ballad of Reading Gaol stand as Wilde's spiritual and artistic legacy. They demonstrate the resilience of creativity in the face of suffering, the ability of art to redeem even the most broken life. If Wilde's earlier works mocked society's hypocrisies, these later writings exposed the human cost of those hypocrisies with raw honesty. In retrospect, Wilde's prison writings can be seen as prophetic. He gave voice to the voiceless, humanizing prisoners and exposing the cruelty of the penal system. His compassion for the marginalized reflected his own experience as an outcast, but it also anticipated later critiques of justice and punishment. The figure of Wilde the dandy had been destroyed, but in its place emerged Wilde the witness, a man who bore testimony to suffering and injustice. This transformation, though born of pain, gave his life a new kind of meaning. On May 19, 1897, Oscar Wilde walked out of Reading Gaol a free man, but he was no longer the same person who had entered 2 years earlier. Physically weakened, financially ruined, and socially disgraced, Wilde emerged into a world that no longer celebrated him. His plays were absent from the stage, his family had left England, and his name was synonymous with scandal. Though he was technically free, Wilde faced a life in exile. England, which had once applauded him, now treated him as a pariah. Seeking anonymity and a chance at peace, he crossed the Channel and settled on the continent, beginning the final chapter of his life in France. One of the most painful consequences of Wilde's downfall was the loss of his family. Constance Wilde, who had endured the humiliation of his trials, moved abroad with their sons, Cyril and Vivian. To protect them from the stigma, she changed their surname to Holland. Wilde was not entirely cut off from his children. He longed for them and occasionally received updates, but he never saw them again. The separation weighed heavily on him. He had adored his sons and delighted in writing stories for them, yet his disgrace made reconciliation impossible. Constance, though sympathetic to his suffering, could not risk exposing the children to scandal. Wilde's exile thus carried a double pain, the loss of home and the loss of family. In exile, Wilde adopted the name Sebastian Melmoth, a reference to the Gothic novel Melmoth the Wanderer by his great-uncle Charles Maturin. The name symbolized Wilde's sense of himself as a wanderer, cursed and restless, bearing the weight of sin and exile. It allowed him a degree of anonymity while also embodying his tragic self-image. Wilde drifted across France, Belgium, and Italy, living in cheap hotels and boarding houses. He depended on the generosity of friends such as Robert Ross and other sympathizers who provided financial support. Despite his disgrace, Wilde retained a small circle of loyal companions who recognized his genius and refused to abandon him. Perhaps surprisingly, Wilde resumed his relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas after leaving prison. The two reunited in Naples in 1897, attempting to rekindle their romance. For Wilde, the reunion represented both passion and weakness. He still loved Douglas deeply, despite the bitterness expressed in De Profundis. But the relationship was short-lived. Douglas's family threatened to cut off his allowance, and friends urged Wilde to break free from the toxic bond. By 1898, the two had parted for good, though their story remained forever entwined. Wilde's inability to sever ties with Douglas revealed the depth of his longing for love, even at the cost of his stability. Wilde's final years were marked by poverty. He lived in small hotels in Paris, often unable to pay the bills. Friends would quietly settle his debts to prevent him from being thrown out. His once lavish lifestyle had vanished. The man who had dined at the finest restaurants now relied on the charity of others. His health, already damaged by prison, continued to decline. He suffered from chronic ear infections, which caused him excruciating pain, and his constitution weakened under the strain of poverty and neglect. Alcohol became both a solace and a poison, accelerating his decline. Yet even in these conditions, Wilde retained flashes of wit. Friends recorded conversations in which his humour remained undimmed, though tinged with melancholy. He once quipped, "My wallpaper and I are fighting a duel to the death. One of us has got to go." This, spoken near the end of his life, epitomized his ability to face despair with irony. In the autumn of 1900, Wilde's health took a final turn. His ear infection developed into meningitis, leaving him bedridden in the shabby Hôtel d'Alsace, now L'Hôtel, on the Rue des Beaux-Arts in Paris. Attended by loyal friends, including Robert Ross, Wilde endured his last weeks with a mixture of suffering and stoic humour. On November 30th, 1900, Wilde died at the age of 46. He was received into the Roman Catholic Church on his deathbed, a final act that fulfilled his long-standing fascination with Catholicism. His last words, apocryphally reported, combined wit and resignation. "Either that wallpaper goes or I do." Wilde was buried in the Cimetière de Bagneux, but in 1909 his remains were moved to Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris. His tomb, designed by sculptor Jacob Epstein, features a modernist winged sphinx and has become a site of pilgrimage. Visitors leave flowers, letters and kisses, honouring the man who once declared that the only duty we owe to history is to rewrite it. Wilde's exile was paradoxical. On one hand, it represented his fall from grace, the once celebrated playwright reduced to obscurity, shunned by the society that had adored him. On the other, it gave him a kind of freedom. No longer bound by the expectations of London society, Wilde could reflect more honestly on life, love and suffering. His writings from exile, though sparse, carried a tone of resignation and insight. In letters and conversations, he spoke of the necessity of embracing sorrow and finding beauty even in ruin. His earlier celebration of pleasure had given way to a recognition of suffering as central to the human condition. Wilde's final years also contributed to the myth of his life. The image of the brilliant wit, broken by society yet still defiant in spirit, became central to his legacy. The shabby hotel room in Paris, the tragic reconciliation with Douglas, the witty deathbed remark all became part of the Wilde legend. Friends like Robert Ross worked tirelessly to preserve his reputation, ensuring that his works would not be forgotten. Over time, Wilde's exile came to be seen not only as a personal tragedy, but as a symbol of society's cruelty and art's resilience. Oscar Wilde's exile and death crystallized his story as one of brilliance and tragedy. He had soared to the heights of fame and fallen into disgrace, yet he had also transformed suffering into profound art. His final years in Paris, though marked by poverty, gave the world the Ballad of Reading Gaol and the enduring example of his courage. For many, Wilde's death at 46 represents the cruelty of a society unwilling to accept difference. Yet his story also reveals the resilience of the human spirit, the ability to find beauty even in decay. Wilde's exile, far from erasing his genius, ensured that he would be remembered not only as a wit, but as a martyr to art and love.